Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm really excited to be talking about another Booker Prize shortlist, Celtic Breeze, this time from way back in 2005, a good 15 years ago. Now, on the surface, this seems like a bit of a random year, and in many ways, many of the years from here on out are going to be somewhat random as I sort of look back and dip into various shortlists from the past, particularly those I can actually find. It's actually surprisingly hard to find a lot of them. But 2005 has a very special place in my heart. I was a little 16-year-old when the list was announced, and I don't remember it directly from that time, but I do remember sort of within a year or two of that shortlist, having read most of them actually, partly because I was part of a little local book club, which is what every super cool 17-year-old does, and as a result got to discuss and read some incredible books. And for that reason, the 2005 shortlist has a special place in my heart. But I thought before I would review it and kind of look back on it for this channel, I would have a little read of them again to see if I still felt the same about those books. Because I was very aware that I was at risk of overly romanticizing some of those books and remembering them as these beautiful, incredible things, or unfairly maligning some of them due to how long ago it was. But I'm happy to say that this is actually a list that I am really excited about. Of all the shortlists I've read so far, this has to be, I think, my favorite. Not only because of the kind of nostalgia that I have attached to some of these books, and I sort of must preface a lot of this by saying that this is then, as a result, my second time reading many of these books, but also that I just think it's an incredibly strong shortlist. As I'll kind of touch on when we talk about it, these are often by authors that, even if they weren't big at the time in 2005, have gone on to have massive careers in writing. Talking about like Zadie Smith, Ali Smith, John Banville, everybody else's name I'm forgetting, Sebastian Barry, Kazuo Ishiguro, and who else am I forgetting? Oh yes, and Julian, of course. So that is a shortlist that involves so many big name authors, whether they were at the time or not. And I think that's really reflective of perhaps why this is such a strong list. This is a list of very high caliber authors. And even though there were some that I didn't necessarily get on with as well at the time, I've gone back and reread them and absolutely loved them. And as a result, you know, whether you like Goodreads or ratings or whatever themselves, they're kind of obviously very subjective and in some ways meaningless. This is, I think, the first shortlist that I've given every book 5 stars to. Maybe that's just because I'm incredibly generous with my 5-star ratings, and that is a fair point. But I think at the same time, there is a lot of incredible literature to be found within these books. So let's start both alphabetically and with the winner, which is John Banville's The Sea. Now, this book I didn't necessarily get on with massively well at the time when I was sort of 17 or 18 maybe, and I kind of thought, I still enjoyed it. I still thought there was a lot of value to it, but actually something was really special about this, which was story time. There was a in this book club, it was me, I think probably 18 maybe at the time, 17 or 18, one other person who was in her early 30s, and then everybody else was sort of 50 or 60 plus. And as a result, there was this little kind of coterie of about 4 or 5 women in their 60s who were always just such good fun, because they were the most attentive and careful readers you could really hope for with any literature. They also had no problem in denouncing a book that they thought was awful. That was often because it was too violent or too sexual or too graphic in some way. But they were incredibly detailed readers. You know, they said it themselves. It sounds a bit morbid, but they kind of said, we don't have time for bad books. If a book is not enjoyable, I'm just going to skip it, because life's too short. And it's something actually that on BookTube, Britta Burler has also said, which I really appreciate, is actually, I have a real issue with putting down books that I've not enjoyed. I feel the need to kind of grind out to the end and kind of get the most out of it, or get something out of it, or at least be able to claim that I finished it. But they are very much, and these old women from the book group were very much of the opinion that you just put it down if you don't like it. And one of the women in that book group, I really wish I could remember her name, she hated almost every book that was put forward month on month. She would, you know, even if she enjoyed parts of it or enjoyed bits of the story, she would always have a lot to say. And I loved listening to her kind of catty comments about the writing and about how a certain plot point didn't make any sense or how it was lazy in some part. And then we got to John Banville's The Sea, and you know, the appreciation around the room was, it was somewhat mixed. There was majority people liking it and thought it was a beautiful book, but maybe had some issues with it. This woman who had criticized so many other books suddenly was just full of praise, and we never heard that again. We never heard it before. She was so full of praise for this book, and at the time I didn't really understand it. I thought it's beautiful, but there are some bits missing. However, then this year I chose to reread it. I had a copy lying around the house, and I hadn't given it away to the charity shop because I did tell myself at some point I'd reread it, not only because it won the prize, but because I just thought maybe it's a book that might warrant a second read. And it's a fairly short book. It's about 250 pages or so. And I thought, you know what, go on, let's try this out again. Then I reread it, and my goodness, I adored it. This was actually the only book that I had left on the list that I didn't have as a 5-star book on Goodreads or whatever. And I reread it and just thought, this is stunning. I don't think I gave it enough time when I was sort of 17 or 18, whenever I read it. I don't think I really appreciated the beauty of the language and the complexity of the story. In the time between being 17 or 18 and being now 31, I have sort of developed a bit of a love for stories that of people later in life looking back wistfully over their younger days and realizing their mistakes. There's maybe a point in there somewhere. I wonder what that is. But I have really come to appreciate novels with that really wonderful sweeping tone. Julian Barnes's sense of an ending, I think, is stunning for similar reasons, that you just have this gorgeous look back on someone's life and actually the ways that they were completely oblivious to their own errors and to their own bad mistakes within those times, or how they hurt people. And this book, I think, is in many ways no exception to that. It is absolutely stunning, in my opinion. Really rich, poetic, flowery language. And I think when I was younger, when I first read it, I think I was put off by that. And I totally get it if people are put off by that of it. I think that's been the main criticism people have of it, is that it's a plot that is mostly someone with their meandering thoughts about their childhood. Not really that much happens in the present day. It's incredibly flowery in the sense that there are many, many words that I have never come across anywhere else that are very, very specific. But there's a richness to it, and I think that's what I appreciate this time. I mean, I realize the kind of, this is an unintended pun, but you do have to let the language wash over you. Yes, it's called The Sea, waves, whatever, but it's a book where actually it feels very almost watery in that sense. You need to let the whole story flow over you. This is sounding like a really strained metaphor here, but it is stunning, I think. And there are a couple of passages as I was going through that I did that terrible thing that people hate of dog-earing pages. It's my copy, it's fine. But of just how beautiful the language was. So here is a passage that I thought was particularly beautiful, that for me kind of sums up why I really appreciated this book on the second read recently. So, when the Colonel followed her into the kitchen, angling for afternoon tea, at least, she was quite sharp with him, and he scuttled off to his room and the commentary to a football match on the wireless. I too retreated to the lounge with my book, Belle en Bonnard, dull as ditch water, but I could not read, and put the book aside. Bun's visit had upset the delicate equilibrium of the household. There was a sort of noiseless trilling in the atmosphere, as if a fine, taut alarm wire had been tripped and was vibrating still. I sat in the bay of the window and watched the day darken. Bare trees across the road were black against the last flares of setting sun, and the rooks in a raucous flock were wheeling and dropping, settling disputatiously for the night. I mean, come on, like, that is gorgeous. And I think the story itself follows that kind of pattern. The language is like that almost throughout. It's very, very dense in parts, but I think you do just need to let it wash over you. There are so many words I didn't understand, I didn't know the definitions to, but I actually didn't think that it was necessarily right to go and look up every single word. I kind of felt the need to let those words just wash over me, again, pun unintended, and really feel that, because a lot of the words, it felt like they were almost in there for the sound of them, almost more than the definition. And I really appreciated that. I'd love to hear this as an audiobook, actually. I kind of get the feeling that if done right, and perhaps in the right dialect, I think this would be incredible and outstanding. And that's, I think, maybe the difference between reading it at 17 and reading it now. For me, has been that I felt that maybe it was just luck of the draw this time, but I felt like I tuned into the language and the rhythm of this book a little bit better now. I think maybe at 17, I was hoping that it would be a bit more actiony. The story itself isn't particularly actiony, but it does. It focuses on a character who is thinking back over his life. He's now in his older years. He is kind of really thinking back about a lot of what's happened, and he thinks back to some time he spent by the sea, and the kind of terrible circumstances that happened. So there were two twins he was with, and or sort of spent a lot of time with. And he sort of fancied one of them, and then sort of fancied the mother after a while, and that was sort of part of his sexual awakening in some ways. As well as that, the twin brother was this sort of mute boy, and there was a lot of cruelty and a lot of violence that took place between these twins, either with each other or terrorizing their maid or their kind of governess, and lots of this really deep layered storytelling where he will sort of jump between times. You'll get a little bit about the twins being cruel, and then something about the death of his wife, and then something about his daughter and their strained relationship, and his daughter now really hoping to try and look after him, you know, worried about him in his older age and how she can best protect him. But at the same time, he's having all of these past memories about his youth and about difficulties, and it actually reminds me a lot of Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, who was also nominated here. Fun fact also, so when Kazuo Ishiguro won the Booker Prize for The Remains of the Day, he closely beat out John Banville for the prize. Then this 2005, apparently the final vote came down to Kazuo Ishiguro and John Banville again. And this time it was obviously given to John Banville. I'll talk a bit more about my thoughts later. With this shortlist, I would happily have any of the 6 win, genuinely. But I actually think that John Banville winning is a really good one. I think it makes a lot of sense. Of all the books in that shortlist, I think they've all actually weathered the last 15 years pretty well. They all still read as fairly contemporary books. But I think John Banville's The Sea, there is something quite magical about this. I think this is a book that, had it not won the prize, could perhaps easily have been pushed to the side and maybe forgotten about a little bit more. So I'm really glad that because of the prize win, this is a book that we speak about a bit more. Whereas all of the other authors on the list, Kazuo Ishiguro, Julian Barnes, Ali Smith, Zadie Smith, and Sebastian Barry, are all authors who are still, you know, their books are still selling incredibly well, are still really, they're authors who are all really highly respected, as is John Banville, but I think this is especially kind of powerful for him. And he found it quite strange, apparently, after he won, because it had been such a strong shortlist. People didn't actually expect, again, that John Banville would win, or kind of expected at least that one of the other authors would take it over him. And as a result, it was very strange, because obviously they'd chosen him as the winner, and the next few days in the media, people were kind of talking about how it was a surprise that a lot of these other novels didn't win. And John Banville sort of said, you know, well, you know, they awarded me the prize, they could at least now speak well of the novel. And he seemed a bit kind of put off by the fact that people had chosen him obviously as a winner, and then went on to kind of be like, well, yes, but let's talk again about Kazuo Ishiguro and let's talk about all these other novels. But I think still, yeah, John Banville's The Sea, I think, is just a wonderful, wonderful novel. I'd say it's probably maybe not for everyone, but let it wash over you and see if that works best for you. Next up, we have Sebastian Barry with A Long, Long Way. Now, this book is all about World War I and focusing on the lives of soldiers, not only obviously kind of going off to war and all of that, that small thing, but also the kind of inner lives of them processing what war looks like to them, and the kind of what they leave behind, what it looks like for the people who are left in their hometowns, hoping desperately that people come back, and again what that means for relationships. And there's a real theme around relationships in this novel, not only about kind of friends and what friends do and don't tell each other, about people's conduct during war. There are a couple of stories of people doing heinous things during the time of war, and about whether you take that home to the people who are at home. Do you tell people that this has happened? Do you know, if someone's loved one has died, do you come back home with the story that they actually did these horrendous things and put other people's lives in danger? Or do you just let that person go on thinking that their spouse or their like son or father was a terrible person? Do you do that? And that was a really central part of the story. I sometimes struggle with war novels. I think maybe because I've read a lot of them. I think I had to read a lot of them at school, because somehow at one point in the English literature curriculum, I think it was pretty much you do World War I and World War II literature for quite a lot of years in a row. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of incredible literature to take from that time. Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon's poetry remain some of my absolute favorites of all time. But I think I was maybe a bit overdone with war poetry and war literature at that time, and have not really been able to go back to it easily. But I think it's to Sebastian Barry's praise. I think that it says a lot about his writing, that he can take a topic that has been so maybe not overdone, but at least done quite heavily, and still manages to find something quite new and quite striking about it. So there's a real sensitivity to the novel, and I think what for me was so special is that I think this is something that I've heard people talk about a lot with Sebastian Barry before, and I think I finally get it after reading this book, is he's got a really brilliant way of striking that middle line between being an incredibly easy commercial author to read. So, you know, you can fly through his books, but there's a real magical literary quality to the work that kind of transcends that. And I realize that sounds very high and low culture, and that's not the intention. But I think often, you know, something that's really easy to read and to really find yourself within can sometimes be, you know, people sometimes attack it for not being heavyweight enough, and that is an unfair criticism a lot of the time. But you know, there's often that balance, and I think that A Long Long Way is a very rare novel in that sense of there being an absolute poetry to a lot of the literature and to the kind of phrasing, but without that ever bogging down the story or feeling like he's sort of being like, hey, look over here, look at me being really clever with my big words and everything. And so I think actually it's really interesting in a short list like this, where you've got John Banville being so poetic and, you know, using so many dense literary words that you would never really see in day-to-day life. And Sebastian Barry being quite literary, but in a very approachable and very easy to access way. I think I mean, they're quite fun novels to have side by side, but both gorgeous. And I feel like I definitely want to read a lot more of Sebastian Barry based on this. I know that he's quite a highly praised author, and I have to admit I didn't really know much about him at all. I'd seen his books out there in shops, but yeah, it seems fantastic. And I think this is a really powerful war novel, one that could have been so easily mismanaged and could so easily have just been, you know, saccharine and overdone and overly sentimental, but instead manages to find something quite poignant and beautiful in there, almost trusting the audience to kind of think, yes, okay, we know this about the war, we don't need to go into details on all of these little bits, but we're going to focus on this individual life here and go from there. And I think it's stunning. Next up, we have one of my absolute favourite authors of all time, Julian Barnes. I'm very, very excited to be going back through a lot of his back catalogue and trying to engage with it. There's a lot that I haven't read of his, but he is a bit of a mainstay in the Booker Prize. He's kind of come up a few times and won the prize with A Sense of an Ending, as I mentioned earlier. But he was nominated in 2005 for Arthur and George, which is a wonderful little... Being attacked by my cat here. Here we go. Who is after some food I have here. Here we go. You all right? Good. We have Arthur and George by Julian Barnes, and that is a novel all about a true story, allegedly, of Arthur Conan Doyle. You okay there? Show yourself to the camera, little one. Being a pet owner is great fun. So Arthur and George is the story of Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous writer of the Sherlock Holmes series. And you want to show your face? Go on. There we go. There you go. The creator of the Sherlock Holmes series, and a real life friendship he struck up with a man called George, surprise, who was falsely accused and then imprisoned of a crime he didn't commit. That was all to do with apparently tearing horses apart. There we go. But it was a much more complicated story in real life because George himself had Indian heritage, and a lot of people sort of believed that there was that racial element really played into it, that people intentionally meant him harm because of that, and that the police intentionally overlooked certain things because they just wanted to have a speedy prosecution and get everything sorted. Arthur Conan Doyle, despite having many people write into him all the time with various crimes that had taken place that they wanted him to solve in real life, he would, frequently reply to them that that's not what he did. He was a crime writer. He did not solve these crimes, even if the crimes in his books were incredibly detailed and thought through. However, he decided to take up this crime because he felt that there was a real miscarriage of justice going on and got involved. But I think what's so powerful about Julian Barnes's writing, and this is something I've adored about so many of his other books, is there is a real tenderness to how he treats characters. There's a real beauty to the observation of everyone in books, in his books. He's very generous, I feel. He can look at characters who are quite problematic or perhaps not that likable in various ways and find something to love about them. And the beauty of the language is always something that's clever about Julian Barnes. For me, Julian Barnes and J.M. Coetzee occupy a very similar place in my mind, which is I start reading, I think, oh, this is all right and everything. And then at some point I just go, oh, you clever bastard. And I'm suddenly struck by just how incredible their writing is, not only because of the quality of the language itself, but also the plotting, that there'll be something that isn't even a twist necessarily, but kind of just comes up and you suddenly realize that the whole thing has been set up all along. I love authors who can do that so subtly. It's a skill I wish I could master, and I really need to focus on trying to master for my own writing. But I think it's something so special to be able to read a Julian Barnes novel. This novel is about 500 pages long, but it never really feels like it, not only because you're following a case, and I think actually that's something that's really clever about what Julian Barnes has done here. You've got, it's about Arthur Conan Doyle, and it feels like it could belong in a Sherlock Holmes series. What's also really clever is he's clearly done research about Arthur Conan Doyle, who at various points in his career wanted to kill off Sherlock because although it had brought him so much notoriety and fame and money, he kind of felt wedded to this character. He kind of couldn't write anything else without being considered, without somebody saying, okay, great, but when are you going to go back to more Sherlock Holmes? Equally, what I think is fascinating about this novel for me is that Arthur Conan Doyle and George he obviously lived within this kind of, you know, this sort of Victorian time, or kind of just coming out of Victorian times. And I think what's so powerful is how well Julian Barnes captures that feeling of the Victorian age, of that real growth in science and industry, but how a lot of people at the time were kind of these Renaissance men kind of figures. Obviously there were women who were doing this as well. It's a problematic term, but you know, people who were who did everything, who were scientists and mathematicians and artists and writers and various other things all at once. And, you know, it wasn't quite the same categorization that we find nowadays, where, you know, people tend to find one field and be a bit more specialized. In Victorian times, there was this real growth in knowledge and people wanting to know more. And so you have people like Charles Dickens, who obviously was sort of focused much more on being a writer, who also were really interested in a lot of the scientific discoveries and changes at the time, who would also be really clued in around about art and about various other things. So I think it was a really interesting time in British history, and obviously a problematic one. Empire was happening at the same time, not great. But I think Julian Barnes really captures that feel of these characters who are kind of completely unburdened by the label of kind of an area they should stay to, but are also so excited about the discoveries of the time. Everything is new. This is a time where new discoveries were coming up all the time that just seemed to transform society and transform the way that people saw things. And it's incredible that that gets captured in a novel that itself feels like a Sherlock Holmes case and comes to quite a satisfying ending and paints these characters so beautifully. But yeah, I just think it's a masterpiece, as is pretty much everything Julian Barnes puts his pen to. So for me, this was another absolutely fantastic novel to go to. Next, we go to Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, a novel all about, you know, humans versus technology versus sort of robotization, and the kind of idea of what makes a human human, what makes memories true, what is a soul, all of those kinds of very human questions. And it feels almost strange that this is an Ishiguro novel, because in many ways this feels like everything that Ian McEwan has been writing for the last 10-15 years. I absolutely adore this novel. It has a massive twist towards the end that I really don't want to spoil, and so that's what's quite I think interesting about rereading this novel, is there is something so special about knowing that at the beginning. I remember at the time, before I read it, a friend of mine who adored it told me not to watch the film first, not because the film was bad in any way. In fact, I really like the film, but because the twist towards the end is so big that to go into reading the novel knowing that already would be to miss a trick in some ways. I mean, if you have watched the film first, either way you get the twist and it's exciting and powerful. But I think what's so great about this book is how well Ishiguro gets into this kind of society. There's so much that's hinted at and slowly unraveled throughout the novel that if you don't know what's coming, makes it genuinely quite shocking, because you have been led down this path and you know something's up, but you're not quite sure what. You know, characters talk in a certain way or have certain fears, and that sort of really sparks those kind of conflicts in your mind about what could possibly be happening here. I think it's absolutely stunning as a book, and it's one of those books as well that probably of all of this shortlist has probably made the most impact on the kind of the public consciousness, in terms of it's frequently seen as one of those books that's remembered as one of the best novels of the 21st century. It's frequently referred back to as, you know, one of Ishiguro's best novels, and so it's probably no surprise that this was in the running at, you know, in the final two with John Banville for the prize, because actually these are both incredible novels, and Ishiguro's novel, I think, is one of those ones that people remember and spend a lot of time thinking about long afterwards. Ishiguro is an author who I adore. I've read probably about 5 or so of his novels. There are a lot more that I need to go back and read. His Booker Prize shortlisted novels are all, in my opinion, incredible. He won, as I mentioned before, for The Remains of the Day, which I just think is incredible as a novel. It's absolutely beautiful. I really urge you, if you enjoy Never Let Me Go, to go back and look at some of his other books, particularly as they are so different in tone and in theme. He often speaks a lot about, or writes a lot about memory and the power of memory, and particularly the idea of characters moving to a different culture and thinking back and remembering things. And about this idea of almost these outcasts, sort of people trapped between two cultures, which, you know, for Ishiguro himself, being sort of having Japanese family, having moved to the UK when he was quite young, there is this real, you know, that kind of seems to come up a lot in his work, and I think it's something really powerful. But a lot of his novels really focus on Japan. And so Never Let Me Go is one of his few that I know of, at least, that seems to be really very focused on being in the UK. It's a really powerful work of fiction, and one of those books that kind of, in many people's minds and in my mind, kind of belong alongside books like The Handmaid's Tale and various other sort of modern sci-fi novels that are, well, I say sci-fi, but kind of novels that deal with sort of utopias and dystopias in a really powerful, urgent way. And I think it's a book that should not be overlooked. I mean, looking at kind of books from 2005, of course, this book is in the list. There is almost no 2005 list, best of or whatever, that I don't think would ignore this book. It's so powerful. It's really beautifully done. I know that for some people it's maybe not stood the test of time as well as they would have liked. So maybe it doesn't hold up as strongly, but I mean, it's the sheer force of the writing behind it is just so powerful that I think you can't really deny it. And I think for many people that's actually almost why it was such a surprise that John Banville won. Again, not because it's a bad novel, but because Never Let Me Go was such a tour de force in that year. It's a novel that I don't think was easy to escape. And finally, we come to the two Smiths. So first up, Ali Smith with The Accidental. Now, this was also part of the book club that I was part of at that time. I'm starting to think, the more I think back to that book club, that they were very heavily influenced by the 2005 Booker shortlist. Because of that entire shortlist, I think we covered 3 of the shortlist, and I think, you know, I stopped going after a while because I went off to university. Or went off somewhere else. I think it was to university. I must have been about 18. And as a result, I kind of didn't keep going. But that was a time when, you know, so many of these books are being discussed and were being gone over. But Ali Smith with The Accidental. I love Ali Smith. This is my sort of preface to everything within this. I adore her writing. For me, she is that exact right level of playfulness and silliness and absurdity alongside really bloody good writing and really powerful plotting. She's always incredibly current. She's always so on the nose with her observations about humans, even, well, almost especially their foibles and their sillinesses. She spends a lot of time, I think, and a lot of focus on teenage characters, or on characters who are quite young, who are kind of undergoing sort of changes in identity, particularly identities that have a kind of queer subtext. Or, so in How to Be Both, for example, another one of her novels, there is a sort of sexual awakening of this young girl. In The Accidental, there is a young teenage girl who is sort of somewhat besotted by this character who enters the story. So this character is called Amber. She enters the story and completely upends everyone's lives. So it's a family of 4. And in this family, you have a mother who is a writer, but seems to be kind of, in some ways, caught up in kind of her own sort of fictions and her own dead end sort of life, and Amber kind of shakes her up and really disrupts that, and even calls her really boring and tells her that she's dead inside, which is actually weirdly quite satisfying as a reader, because although you feel quite bad for the mother, you also do almost agree a little bit with Amber on this. You've got the father who is who regularly cheats and has affairs with students. So in Amber, this kind of young-ish woman comes into their lives, there's almost this assumption that he's going to try it on with her, and that he's going to think that because he's this sort of university professor, he's going to so easily kind of charm his way into her pants or whatever. And what I think is so powerful in terms of her disrupting their lives is that she never gives that to him. She is quite standoffish, and seems to want to destroy him, or at least doesn't really take him very seriously. She has sex with the son, Magnus, which is sort of taking his virginity, and Magnus is going through a lot because he feels incredibly responsible for having created an image that was then used to bully, sort of a photoshopped image that was then used to bully a young girl in school, who then took her life. And you've got the daughter herself, who is sort of young, really trying to find her way, is sort of taking pictures of, or taking videos of everything. She's basically sort of lives her life through a camera. And Amber, bit by bit, sort of upends every single part of that. So she seems to give something back to Magnus, almost recognizing that yes, he's done wrong, but he needs to feel loved and respected, which he's not necessarily getting from his parents. You've got the young daughter who is obsessed with living through a lens, and Amber throws her camera off a motorway overpass and destroys it. Obviously not going to survive that. And that kind of forces her to sort of start living differently in some ways as well. And when this family come back from their holiday in which they met Amber, they suddenly just see that everything in their house has been taken. Absolutely everything has been stolen. And they obviously think it's something to do with Amber, because she's just this such an esoteric and bizarre character who's just sort of come into their lives and seems destined to ruin everything. But in the destruction of, or you know, in the theft of everything from their house, they're sort of forced to start again and to come together a bit more as a family. You know, the two children were somewhat distant from the parents, and in some ways she not only destroys their lives but kind of rebuilds them. So it's quite powerful and quite interesting. It reminds me a bit of Swimming Home by Deborah Levy, which also features this idea of a mysterious woman coming in, turning everything around, and then leaving. And in both circumstances, there seems to be almost a threat of violence or something not quite right about them. But at the same time, the characters need that impetus to change. But I think what ties this together and makes this work for me is just the sheer power of Ali Smith's writing. Again, as I mentioned, she's so playful, she's so silly at times. So she'll happily go on these little thought experiments or kind of stream of consciousness sort of escapades about a certain word or a certain phrase that someone used. So for example, this woman, Amber, there are so many plays on her name throughout. So after Amber disappears, nobody talks about Amber anymore, apart from the young girl Astrid, who is obsessed with her still and kind of can't quite get her out of her mind, and you know, looks through all of her old video footage and can't find Amber anywhere, even though they filmed loads of things together. And she starts pointing out everything red for a while. So she will start talking, you know, whenever the traffic lights are going, she always talks about the amber light until her parents clock on. There's another instance where she starts pronouncing a B on any word that has AM in it. So for example, if someone says, you know, how are you doing? She might say, instead of I am good, it might be like I am good, and sort of throwing in Amber's name everywhere. It's amazing. It kind of works a lot on the page, and it's so frenetic and so energetic as a book that I think that really carries off. For example, the father, who is a professor, he works a lot with poetry, and that's also meant to be seen as part of his weird kind of character flaw, in that he's so obsessed with this kind of flowery language that he doesn't see anything going on in his life, or he kind of almost feels that he can charm female students with these poems and with these sonnets, and love poems particularly. So there's actually a section where all of his part is written in sonnet form, or at least in poem form, which seems really silly, and it is quite experimental, but is another reason for why I absolutely adore Ali Smith. This novel to me is great. It occupies such a fun place in my heart. A friend of mine went to one of the book clubs with me when we were discussing The Accidental, and we just absolutely adored the silliness and the playfulness of this language. I don't think this was as well received necessarily by everyone in the group. As I mentioned, there was the woman who loved John Banville's The Sea, was a bit more critical of The Accidental and of Ali Smith. But for me, it's such a great novel. I mean, it's a really good gateway into Ali Smith, I think. This was my first Ali Smith book, and I've read a few since. And yeah, I think it's just exactly, you know, it's so good to read. You know, I've only read 2 so far of her, the kind of the season quartet, starting with Autumn. But for me, Autumn and Winter and How to Be Both all have that same playfulness and silliness that I absolutely adore about Ali Smith. And it's so easy for that silliness to just feel completely meaningless, but it goes somewhere. It always does something. And I think that's what's so great just generally about Ali Smith. So I'm going to stop gushing about how amazing Ali Smith is in a moment. But I do want to, I do really want to praise this book very highly. I think it's interesting because I think this was a really good springboard for her. I think she's since taken herself off being shortlisted for, or being submitted for the Booker Prize shortlist, because she found the whole process really stressful to have people every year or two kind of talking about her chances of winning the prize. You know, she doesn't write for the prizes, she writes because she wants to say something. I also should say, in terms of going over Booker Prizes more generally, this and Unless by Carol Shields, to my knowledge, the only 2, there may be more, are the only 2 Booker Prize shortlisted books that also reference the Booker Prize. So in Carol Shields' Unless, she references Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin winning the Booker Prize in 2000. And in The Accidental, she references The Life of Pi, because the mother goes to a book club where they talk about, oh, some book that won the Booker Prize, all about a tiger and a man. And yeah, so it's always fun to see those little nods. Obviously, she wouldn't have known at the time of writing that she'd be shortlisted, but this wasn't her first shortlist either. So I like to kind of see that as a weird kind of Easter egg almost in the book. I just think it's really fun. And finally, a book on the list by an author who needs almost no introduction, at least to British readers, is Zadie Smith's On Beauty. So this is a novel that I almost, for my shame, didn't really remember reading. So we did cover this in the book club as well when I was sort of 17 or so. And I thought I remembered reading it. But around the same time, we read Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And for me, something about the front covers with that like purpley thing was very, very similar. So for a long time, I just assumed that everything that I thought I remembered about On Beauty had actually happened in Purple Hibiscus, and could not disentangle the 2 of them in my head. And so when it came around, I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to actually read On Beauty, because I don't think I've read it. But part of me in my head is telling me that I have. And especially then when I got it from the library and saw how long it was, I thought, maybe I have read, I don't think I have read this. Like, I think I would remember a book this long. And then I actually sort of sat down and properly read it and loved it. So On Beauty is all about this group of characters who are kind of based around an American university. At least the husband, Howard, is British and has sort of moved over to the US. And there is a lot within the novel that kind of references kind of race, cultural differences between the UK and the US. And that's kind of borne out especially in the children of these 2 competing families, the Kipps and the Belseys. And both of those families have various kind of British versus American kind of traits kind of going on in them. Now, when I read this the first time, and clearly didn't remember much, I hadn't read Ian Forster's Howard's End, which is what this novel is based on. And also, I have to admit to my own stupidity in the fact that about 300 pages through this 450 odd page novel, I knew that this was a reference to Howard's End by Ian Forster, right? I'd read Ian Forster's Howard's End earlier this year, and about 300 pages, it only sunk in that the character Howard might have something to do with Howard's End. There we go. It was not my finest reading moment. But that, I think, is something incredibly powerful and special about it, because obviously that is a joke throughout. if you're a more intuitive reader than me, and you know that this is based on Howard's End, and you recognize early on that the character is called Howard, given that we meet him in the first chapter, very early into the first chapter, then you would start kind of referencing or like recognizing this idea that like this is going to be his undoing, perhaps like Howard's end, like something's going to go wrong for him, and it does. It's a kind of campus-based novel, and it follows a lot of the same sort of plot points from Ian Forster's Howard's End, one of which is about this idea of a marriage between the two families, and the kind of complications that come up from that. So really early into the novel, we have a marriage that goes wrong. It's basically a novel between Howard's son, his eldest son, and one of the daughters of the other family, and it kind of goes wrong early on, and there's this whole kind of mini drama. But we kind of thought, we expect at first that there's a really horrible breaking up, and it's, there's this horrible kind of reason, but it just sort of turns out that it just doesn't really work. It kind of just fizzles out before it happens, in which case it's actually probably a good thing. But the relationships just get so complex and layered. Howard is the sort of professor, starts having a couple of affairs with students, and it's not very consensual in places, or at least it feels like he's really wielding his power in quite an uncomfortable way. And Zadie Smith does not spare on kind of pulling him up on that. He is meant to be seen as a pretty horrible character, at least in parts. And I think that's what's so brilliant about the book, is you're able to see various ways that he's good, but many ways that he's bad. He also, at one point, sleeps with the daughter of of his sort of rival person, his sort of opposite number in this. Now she is also going around seemingly to kind of try and destroy her father, seemingly because she's not being given much attention by her father, but also just for her own kind of identity, is kind of going on this sort of bit of an escapade of getting what she wants in terms of sort of sleeping with various men who she knows are probably not a great choice, one of which being Howard. And what's so powerful about it is that we are meant to look at him as just being so deplorable in this. Even if Zora kind of leads this, we are still meant to be like, you are such an idiot, Howard. It happens at one point, there's a funeral, and sort of, they're having like a wake at the house or whatever. He comes in, no other guests see him. That's when he has sex with Zora. And you just think, my God, what are you doing? You're just horrible, horrible human. But I think what is so great, and I've not read much Zadie Smith, actually. I think this is the only novel of hers I've read. I need to go back and read a few more of hers. But I think what Zadie Smith does so powerfully here is understand the nuances of those relationships, of the sillinesses of how certain people behave, but never really let anyone fully off the hook, but also not completely set them up as demons. I think, again, it would be so easy to paint all of these, to have good versus bad, the good family versus the bad family. And in fact, you've got a few good people in the bad family, a few bad people in the good family, all kind of trying to make things work. It does a lot about friendship, about family, about the importance of roots and culture and identity. And something that did make me think that I had read it, and then was confirmed as I was reading it, was this wonderful passage where they go to a poetry reading, the kind of a poetry night, like an open mic poetry night, and there is this poem that's described, and we get kind of excerpts of it that apparently goes on for about 10 minutes. And we're meant to see it as really laughable and really self-indulgent. It's this person talking a bit about their identity and roots. And Zadie Smith has the kind of characters cut in almost with narration to kind of just say, yeah, it really wasn't that good. The line that I remembered, and it sort of weirdly stuck with me. I find myself almost every couple of weeks having that kind of cycle through my head. Particularly every time I see the words womb or tomb, because that's the rhyme in it, which is, my womb is the tomb of your preoccupations. Hang on, I've got it here. Of your expectations. Sorry, yes. My womb, she said, is the tomb, she said, of your precious misconceptions. And what's brilliant is Zadie Smith cutting in with not only the she said, she said, she said to kind of break up this line. She's put various words in capitals, And it really does give you that flavor. Like, I've been to open mic nights and things like that where I've heard some pretty terrible poetry, and and it's good for, some people enjoy it, obviously, it's subjective, but you've heard some of that terrible stuff, and you realize that it means a lot to the person who is delivering it, but a lot of the audience is not necessarily on that ride with them. And I think it's really well observed by Zadie Smith, the kind of poke fun at that. And it still feels quite, there's still a lot of heart to it. She's a great author, and I need to go back and read more of hers. But I think that's, again, what's so striking about this list is definitely in 2005, some of these writers would have been fairly new. So I think this was only Zadie Smith's second book, I want to say. So she would have still been fairly new in people's eyes. Ali Smith had not published too many books by then, at least wasn't that well known, I think. Sebastian Barry was like somewhat known. John Banville had been writing for a while. Julian Barnes had been writing for a while. And Kazuo Ishiguro had been writing for a while. But actually, kind of looking at it in hindsight now, 15 years later in 2020, we look back and this is a short list of 6 writers who are really well known within literary sort of circles. They're all still writing, they're all still selling very well. They still feel quite relevant and powerful as writers. And that's kind of incredible because, we look back at some shortlists, and as I've been kind of going through, particularly ones from a while back, where you just think, who is this author? They maybe had this one shortlisted novel in the 80s, and then never anything else. And that's not to say that the Booker Prize is the sum total of all of their successes, even though that's often how they're written about. I realize this with Rose Tremaine, who has been writing for many, many years, and literally is always known as like Booker shortlisted for the Restoration. Rose Tremaine, she's done other things, but it's always quite interesting to me, like, of all the shortlists, this is the shortlist that automatically I knew all of these authors' names, looking back on it. And partly obviously that's because I read some of them at the time, but these are all authors who I've gone on to read other things by, or at least have known of in sort of a fairly substantial way. And you can't necessarily say that for every shortlist. So in some ways it does feel like a populist one. And that's not to take away from the literary merit. For me, these are all incredible books, and I would have happily seen any of these win. But I think it's really, it really speaks to the quality of writing at that time. This was also the beginning of what went on for 4 years, where it went between an Irish author and an Indian author for the win. So John Banville wins for The Sea, and he is followed by an Indian winner, Kiran Desai, who is then followed by an Irish winner, Anne Enright, who is then followed by an Indian writer again, Aravinda Diga, which is kind of just quite a fun thing. Similar things happened earlier in the 2000s with Canadian and Australian writers sort of sharing kind of like that. But it's really interesting to see these kinds of things, because people were saying, oh, this is like a watershed moment in Irish and Indian literature, just because it kind of gone over like that for a few years. However, I must also say this is a very British list. Obviously this is before Americans would have been allowed to enter the prize, but Ali Smith is Scottish, Zadie Smith is British, as is Julian Barnes. Sebastian Barry and John Banville are both Irish. And who have I missed off? Kazuo Ishiguro is British, with Japanese heritage. So it's actually a very, very British list. You normally, around this time in the Booker sort of prize, you would normally see a few more kind of Indian or Canadian authors in the shortlist, or a few from sort of maybe the Caribbean. But yeah, this is a very, very British list. And perhaps that's why it seems like a list that's still so well known in terms of its authors, because these were big mainstays of British literature and still are in many ways. But yes, either way, it's for me a cracking shortlist. I realize I've spent a really long time just telling you how amazing they all are, and they are great. Normally in a shortlist I have at least one or two that I was a bit lukewarm about, or didn't necessarily love, but still saw a bit of merit in. For me, this is a great shortlist. This is, for me, the shortlist to beat, with many other books that have kind of come out. 1984's shortlist for me is a really strong one as well, but for me it does not compare to 2005. But yes, I'd love to know your thoughts. There were many, many other books obviously published around that time. So if there are other books that you think should have been on the shortlist and should have won, please do let me know. Let me know your thoughts about this shortlist itself. And I hope that you do spend time and go back and read them, or at least read other things by these authors. They're all absolutely fantastic books. And I really urge you to check them out. So have a wonderful time reading. And from me and my cat, who is still sat on my lap, despite me being awkwardly balanced on the corner of a chair, have a wonderful day. And yes, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.